Welcome to Lecture 6 of Bio 121, Human Biology and Evolution. I wanted to start today with a quick review of the key points from Unit 5. So you should be able to answer these questions off the top of your head. Number 1, what is the difference between genetic ancestry and race? And relatedly, number 2, how is race defined? Is it a biological concept? The answer to these questions is no, race is not a biological concept, but genetic ancestry is. So ancestry refers to where you inherited your DNA from, but race is socially constructed. It varies across culture to culture and may change over time, and it is not rooted in genetic ancestry. These are completely separate ideas. With that in mind, we're going to discuss social determinants of health today, which are the outside influences on health outcomes. So this is an aspect of epidemiology. You know I love these metacognition activities, so please take out a piece of paper and really write this down so we can revisit it after lecture. Please record what you already know about the following. 1. Name some non-biological factors that influence human health. 2. How do you think a person's social circumstances affect their well-being? 3. How does psychological distress affect the physical body? And 4. Name some healthy ways to manage stress. These questions seem especially relevant during this COVID-19 crisis, where many of us are stuck in our homes and might be feeling the distress of social isolation. Please pause the video and take as much time as you need to keep jotting down your answers to these 4 questions. Here's the structure of today's lecture. This is a brief outline. First, I love to give away the endings at the beginning of my lecture, so I want to tell you right away the definition of social determinants of health, explaining how environment becomes biology and how that influences the way our bodies develop, and brainstorm with you some different levels of influence on human health. Then I'm going to give a global example and a US example closer to home about patterns of health that have been studied in terms of how the social environment and social inequities can predict these patterns. When it comes to the US example, we're going to dive in a little bit to neighborhood qualities, income level disparities, education, access to quality healthcare, and we're going to also examine how racism influences health through each of these avenues, and these have been well studied. And in fact, if you're interested in this topic, you could go into it for a career and research these relationships. And then I'll end today's lecture on a positive note. We'll talk about chronic stress, but then we'll also look at how research suggests we can curb the negative impacts of stress on our health. So to get started, let's recall where phenotypes come from. Remember that the phenotype is the outward expression of our genes. It's measurable factors like height or weight or hormone levels. And the phenotype of an adult results from a combination of the genetic potential that we each inherited from our parents, combined with the environments in which we grew up. So here in this example, you can see that the phenotype of height in these cartoon corn, even if they're genetic clones of one another, meaning they're all identical twin corns, it varies greatly depending on how much sunlight and water was given to the corn while it was growing. That makes sense. But this is also true in humans. For example, here is a photograph of 2 identical twins that when they grew up, they were very different in height. This is common among twins who grew up in different homes, perhaps due to adoption. These two twins in the photograph were actually adopted into different families. The guy on the left was adopted into a rural farming community in China, where his nutritional environment as a youngster was linked to the harvest, and so it was seasonal. Whereas the guy on the right, the taller of the twins, was adopted into a relatively more affluent family in an urban area. And so his nutrition growing up was stable across the months of the year. Differences in phenotype among identical twins who share all the same DNA can also result from differences in the way the placenta delivers nutrients in the womb and a variety of other factors. Today's case study is called Height Plasticity, and it delves deeply into this topic of known influences on height. And height is studied as a probable indicator of overall health and nutritional status and rate of infectious disease during childhood, which is when you were growing in height. So I hope you enjoy that case study, and please don't forget to comment on it in our discussion threads. I mentioned previously that even identical twins can have different phenotypes. And this is true based on even the most early of environments, even prenatal environments. So here is a photograph of twin girls. The girl on the left was born heavier. And we know from a lot of statistical research on birth size and downstream outcomes that just based on the difference in their birth weights, the smaller born twin, the girl on the right, will grow up to be shorter than her sister. She will have reduced lean mass, and this is coming from smaller organs, like she'll have a smaller liver, and also less muscle mass overall. The lighter born twin is also at elevated risk of developing chronic metabolic diseases like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, atherosclerosis. She's more likely to eventually have a heart attack or stroke than her heavier born twin. And this is just based on environments in the womb that led to their different birth weights. So today we're looking at types of experiences that shift this arrow, because we're used to thinking about genes and how they influence our experience and our biology, but get ready for the animation. Today we're looking at how experiences impact gene expression, hormone levels, physiology, and disease risk. And that brings me to the definition of social determinants of health. My definition is that these are the conditions in which people are born, live, and work, and you could also say go to school, that influence health. So it's the environmental conditions that influence our health. And I like to think about this like a multi-layered onion, where the core of the onion are identity things that influence health, like your age, or whether you're a man or a woman, and other really constitutional factors of your identity. And outside of that core being that you have no influence over, like you have no influence over your age, it just is. The next layer is called individual lifestyle factors, and these are things that you choose, like whether or not you smoke. And outside of that, the next biggest ring of influence is social and community networks. So how your inner social circle and the community where you live influences your health. And then we have this thick green line that is all of these living and working conditions. So when we're talking about social determinants of health, we're really talking about, well, that yellow ring and out. But if we break it down into these green sectors, we could study the influence of each of these things on health. And then the outermost ring is just really general socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions that influence living and working conditions. Okay, so that's the intro. But I wanted to point out that this is a huge field of study, so that there's overwhelming evidence that social factors influence health. Things like dirty water, poor nutrition, lack of medical care, these all have clear impacts on health. And these factors do not occur naturally. There's variation, and it's often due to poverty-related discrimination. And in my mind, this presents a moral crisis. Like, we know the importance of clean water on the health of communities. Therefore, is clean water, access to clean water, a basic human right? And if so, whose responsibility is it to make sure every person has access to clean, safe drinking water? I don't have the answer to these questions, but I feel morally obligated to think about them. So here is the international extreme example I promised you on the outline slide. I want to talk about a country named Sierra Leone, where 70% of the population lives in extreme poverty. You may have heard of this country in different contexts. So there was I don't want to call it famous because famous sounds positive. There was a newsworthy civil war that lasted for over a decade, all throughout the 90s. And if you have ever read books or articles or seen interviews with former child soldiers, this was made famous by the Sierra Leone Civil War. It's also known for the diamond trade. The third image down is a picture of an actual diamond mine where workers suffer unsafe working conditions and toil for many hours in a way that would not be legal in the US. And there aren't worker protection laws, and so many people died, and they are called blood diamonds, if you've heard of that term. And also, a few years back, there was an Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone. So for all of these reasons, this country has been in the news over the years. And the life expectancy here is one of the lowest in the world. Life expectancy at birth is 58 years. That means when a woman gives birth, she can expect her baby to only live 58 years. But that's actually up because it was only 34 years during the Civil War. Now that's younger than I am. That's terrible. A 34-year life expectancy in the modern world. That's the lowest I have ever seen. Contrast that with one of the highest life expectancies, which occurs in Japan, and people there can expect to live on average 82 years. What's the difference between people in these countries? We know from the previous unit that the DNA is almost 86% identical, so there's not a genetic explanation for these differences. It's completely a social explanation. Here's another statistic. U5 mortality, this means mortality before the 5th birthday. And it's used often to compare situations in different countries. So you want the lowest U5 mortality rate. However, in Sierra Leone, it's one of the highest. That means 316 babies die per 100,000 born alive. Contrast that with one of the lowest under 5 mortality rates, which occurs in Finland, and only 4 babies die. So again, this is a bummer to think about, but it's a real moral crisis. Why are people in Finland enjoying longer life expectancies, and why are babies so much less likely to die? And are these social differences, how do we possibly justify this to ourselves as a society, as a global society? So there aren't biological explanations for these differences. The explanation for these differences is purely social and economic. And that's what we're talking about today. Here is a data graphic. I will update this once we have good data about coronavirus deaths, but this shows different causes of mortality, different causes of death in different countries, including Sierra Leone over on the right, and its African neighbors, Liberia, and what you can see on these graphs is the higher the height of the bar, the more deaths per that disease. So Ebola was huge. It was in the news. Everybody was freaking out about Ebola, even in the US, where people basically had no risk of getting it. And the Ebola deaths are really tiny. Compare that to things that don't always make the news, like deaths from diarrheal diseases in the light purple and deaths from malaria in dark purple. And as you can see, there's way more deaths from these other diseases that don't make it into the news. So it's like society is choosing to bury its head in the sand with malaria and diarrheal diseases of children, but then when Ebola hits, it's huge news. And what's not shown on this graph is mortality from AIDS, which is triple the rate of malaria deaths in all of these countries. Triple the rate, so it would be off this chart. And I'm not seeing that in the news every day, even though it's causing a lot of deaths. Why not? Why isn't this in the news? Here is a graphic for deaths closer to home. This is in the US, different causes of death during the peak Ebola epidemic in 2014. That was in September and early October 2014. There was 1 death in the US from Ebola from an aid worker who had gone to Africa and then was flown back to the US for medical care, but she was unable to be saved. During that same amount of time, contrast the 1 Ebola death with deaths from unintentional falls, guns, motor vehicle accidents, the flu, diabetes, lung cancer, and heart disease. Yet Ebola was the one in the news. Not only do these other causes of death don't make the news, but I invite you to think about the fact that not every American is equally likely to suffer each of these illnesses or causes of death. Why? Why do health disparities between different people exist? Thinking about why health disparities can exist within one society, here is an example of extreme disparity within one city in the US, Baltimore, Maryland. These 6 images are from Baltimore, but the 2 columns are from different neighborhoods within Baltimore. The images of families riding bikes together on a dedicated pedestrian path, and a grocery store that looks to me like Whole Foods, and a fancy 3-story house. These are from the neighborhood called Roland Park, which is a relatively affluent neighborhood in Baltimore near Johns Hopkins University. The images on the right contrast these, and these are just 3 miles south in a neighborhood called Seton Hill. Within Baltimore, 20% of the population lives in poverty, but there are huge neighborhood differences in wealth distribution, in crime statistics, and in racial composition of the residents of these neighborhoods. And the government seems to perpetuate these differences in neighborhood quality. One example is that the municipal government of Maryland chooses to issue more liquor store permits in neighborhoods predominantly inhabited by people of color. And they issue fewer liquor store permits in neighborhoods that have traditionally been inhabited by white people. Let me show you how close together these neighborhoods are on a map of Baltimore. This map is color-coded by the average life expectancy of folks in different neighborhoods. Up in Roland Park, in this dark blue area, people enjoy the longest life expectancy, similar to the longest life expectancy known worldwide, which is 82 years. Just 3 miles south, in Seton Hill, life expectancy is 20 years shorter. Now, these are all people living in the same municipality, so they have equal access to water. Why are there such differences in life expectancy? And if I were in person, we could have a debate about different aspects of lived experience that influence health, including life expectancy. But one thing that is different between these neighborhoods is the demographics of people who live there, which was produced historically by discrimination in mortgage lending, which you will watch a video about for the assigned videos for this unit. So as a result of different living conditions and different opportunities within Baltimore, white residents and black residents face different health challenges, and here are some results. I already explained to you that life expectancy is 20 years different. But infant mortality is also dramatically different. This is the number of babies who die before their first birthday. 2 versus 16. There are also demographic differences in the number of new AIDS cases and the number of stroke deaths. So the big question today is, what accounts for these differences in health? When we're thinking about health disparities, which is when one group within society appears to enjoy better health outcomes than another group, and we want to explain why this inequality exists, we can look at different avenues. And one hypothesis is that the neighborhoods where people live influence health. And we know this to be true. Here's a quote from one public health study that says, residents in poor neighborhoods have fewer places to exercise and limited access to high quality food. Therefore, residents of poor neighborhoods are more likely to report functional limitations and physical health problems compared with residents of wealthier neighborhoods. So maybe it's just a function of where a person lives. But the story is more complex than just where you live. As another example, we could look at income distribution as a mechanism. And also, not surprisingly, the percentage of people with fair or poor self-perceived health status goes down the more money the person makes. So that's what you're seeing on the graph. The blue line is going down as income increases. Self-rated health has been shown by other types of research to correlate really well with actual health. So if you are feeling unwell, take note and maybe talk to someone about that. Here's another hypothesis. Maybe it's differences in education due to historical discrimination and current access to quality education. Maybe this underlies some of the social disparities we see in health outcomes. So I chose this graph because it separates different death rates, death from different causes in men versus women. And then within the sex, you can see different colored bars, and the different colored bars represent different levels of education. So the green bar, you're all in because you are attending college. So 13 or more years of education, that'd be like any education beyond high school. And what you'll notice is that in both men and women, and for all of these different potential causes of death, you're less likely to die. Contrast that with the blue and the light blue bars. There's this stepwise decline in death rate for every cause and for both sexes as you get more education. So don't be a fool, stay in school. If we were in a classroom together, this would be a lively in-person conversation to have because just like researchers have done, we as a class could together brainstorm different aspects of the social environment to look at to try to alleviate some of these social disparities in health. And one of them is access to quality care, like dental care or health care. So here's some data that has actually studied that. These are dental health disparities in a group of elementary schools in Colorado. So imagine all of the kids in the same elementary school. That means they live in certain proximity to each other, and that holds some water quality things the same, some environmental factors related to location would all be held the same. Nevertheless, dental health correlates with social race. And for all of these outcomes, we look at untreated dental decay, caries history. Caries are another word for cavities. White children had significantly better dental outcomes. So white children had 13% less untreated decay and 17% more sealants. Now I had to look up what sealants are because I'm too old to have ever had them. But some of you who had good dental care growing up, if you're younger than me, you may have had sealants painted on your teeth. It acts like a barrier to bacteria, and so it prevents dental decay. So sealants are considered good. Caries are considered bad. And so what we're seeing here is a racial disparity in health, even though we're controlling a lot of things about the environment because all of these kids went to the same exact schools. Here's another example of quality of care differing by race. Turns out that the courses of treatment differ among Medicare patients. So these are all patients with identical health insurance. They're all using Medicare. If we look at hip replacements, that's in panel A, the one at the top. This is the number of hip replacements in different groups of people, and we see that white women were likelier than black women to receive a hip replacement in all of these years. Now, why? Why would one person who needed a hip replacement get one and another person wouldn't, especially since you have the same exact insurance? On the lower panel, panel C, this is coronary bypass surgeries by demographic. And despite higher rates of cardiovascular disease, black men were less likely than white men to receive a coronary bypass surgery. And you can see the difference, the magnitude difference. So if you want to get a coronary bypass surgery, want is the wrong word. If you need a coronary bypass surgery, you are most likely to get one if you're a white male. And all of these other groups, even though they need one too, were less likely to get one. Why? So we know from a previous lecture that genetics is not an excuse. People aren't genetically different from one another. So when we're looking at health disparities based on demographics and a person belonging to a certain group within the social structure, what we're really seeing is the outcome of social determinants of health. There's no biological difference to explain these trends. It is social discrimination that explains these trends. In the absence of a biological explanation, we are forced to see the reality that the likely explanation is chronic stress related to racism. So please allow me to take one moment to explain the difference between individual and structural levels of racism, because these are two different concepts that could be at play when looking at health patterns. Individual racism comes in the form of specific acts of prejudice committed by a racist person or a racist organization. So some examples include police brutality, Twitter quotes from President Trump, and the rejection letters that Misty Copeland got after her ballet auditions, which if you haven't listened to that Under Armour ad where she's talking about her experiences, please take a moment to watch that. This can be contrasted with structural racism, which is more insidious, it's more hidden. It's institutionalized racism that takes the form of processes, laws, historical norms that are hidden in the fabric of society and therefore are repeated by non-racist people. It's when the system privileges some people while at the same time discriminating against others. And some examples include a U of A recruitment practice, which I'll tell you about next, and criminal sentencing laws that differ for crack versus powder cocaine possession. And these were historically made when the majority of powder cocaine possession arrests were made among young, white, affluent people in their early 20s, versus at that time the majority of crack cocaine possession arrests were made among the African American community. And so even though these drugs are both forms of cocaine, there was much heavier sentencing for crack cocaine possession than for powder cocaine possession, and that is considered an example of structural racism. So let me tell you about this U of A recruitment practice. The University of Arizona, like many major universities, hosts recruitment events at high schools every fall and sometimes throughout the year in hopes that seniors will apply to the University of Arizona. To accomplish this, they rely on a network of alumni volunteers that go out to high schools around the nation, including here in Tucson. Alumni volunteers are adults who presumably have full, busy lives, and yet because of their love of the University of Arizona, because they went there and graduated from there, they're volunteering their time. So I think of volunteers as good doers. Nevertheless, there seems to be a pattern in where these people volunteer to go. They tend to either visit their own high school that they graduated from, or they visit the high school that they send their children to. This, I hope you can connect the logic dots. This means that these alumni who have already successfully attended and graduated from college are returning to the high schools that produced them. So these high schools already produce successful college graduates, and so by volunteering their time at these places where it's reasonable for them to go, they have ties to their own community, but it perpetuates the historical trends, which we know were discriminatory on racial grounds and on economic grounds for admission to the University of Arizona. So this system of relying on alumni volunteers to host recruitment events perpetuates this structure. Now, I learned about this when I attended a talk at the University of Arizona itself in their educational leadership program. And the young researcher who did this study is a Tucson native. She went to Sunnyside High School. She eventually went to the U of A for undergrad and ended up getting her PhD in educational research. She recounted that she didn't remember anybody coming to her high school. And so part of her research project was counting up the number of recruitment events at different area high schools and around the nation. And what she found is that there is an average of 0 events at Sunnyside, where she went to school, even though it's very close to the University of Arizona. So it makes sense that local high school seniors might want to attend the University of Arizona. And in a different part of town, in Catalina Foothills, which is up in the foothills, as its name suggests, there were multiple events per year. And the researcher argued that this is a discriminatory practice that is unwittingly done, and she was urging the University of Arizona to take steps to rectify the situation. Okay, so now that you're thinking about isms on multiple levels, both individual and structural, racism and other isms, let me switch gears back to a little bit more biology focused. And so the next part of the lecture, we'll be thinking about how chronic stress impacts our bodies. And this has been rigorously tested by physiologists and other types of researchers. And it turns out that discrimination, social isolation, feelings of injustice, either witnessing it in the world or feeling that it's been done to you or your family, and feelings of powerlessness all contribute to our stress levels. And this can be studied physiologically. And stress causes actual physical damage to the body. So some quick definitions, and then we'll see how this works. A stressor is any disruption to homeostasis, and homeostasis is the body's kind of normal, relaxed state. And then the stress response is how the body responds to a stressor, trying to restore homeostasis. So if you get amped up, it's how the body calms you back down to baseline. One of the original stress researchers is shown here with a rat. His name is Hans Selye, and he became the father of stress research quite on accident. He was working among a team of lab technicians studying the effects of a hormone injection in rats. and he was nervous to handle the rats. He dropped them frequently, he sometimes squeezed them too tight, and the other technicians didn't have this problem. They were more practiced rat handlers. At the end of this study, it turned out that in Hans Sellier's pack of rats that he was in charge of as a technician, his were the only rats that displayed peptic ulcers, enlarged overactive adrenal glands, shrunken immune organs like the thymus. And since all other lab treatments, like the amount of injections they received, the amount of food they got, their lifestyles, the size of the cage they lived in, all of these factors were the same, it was clear that this technician's abuse of the rats caused the damage. So they had stress by being handled by this Butterfingers. So Hans Selye abandoned that original research project in favor of a new one. He wanted to test all different types of stressors on rat physiology. So he got some funding and a team of scientists together and additional lab techs, and they tested all these different types of stressors. Forced exercise, like on a wheel that doesn't stop, intermittent electric shock of these poor little rats, immobilization for long periods of time, sudden loud noises like claps, and unpredictable interviews. And what he found was that all of the different types of stressors he tested elicited an identical response in the rats. It turned out that physical and psychological stressors had identical effects, and this is important. So forced exercise and electric shock caused the same physical outcomes as sudden loud noises. We now call this the generalized stress response, when physical and psychological distress elicit identical responses. So it turns out it doesn't matter if you're stressed out because of work or if you're actually running away from a scary animal, the effect on your hormone levels and the way your body is responding to psychological versus physical stress is the same. Your hypothalamus activates the sympathetic division of your nervous system. Your heart rate and blood pressure and rate of breathing, that's called respiration, they increase. Your adrenal glands secrete epinephrine. Another word for epinephrine is adrenaline. Your blood flows to your muscles, and your stomach stops digesting. And that's true if you're being chased by a bear or public speaking. This is true in two parallel stress systems in your body, the sympathetic nervous system and your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, called the HPA axis. So in your SNS, this is responsible for speeding up your heart rate so that blood is delivered to your tissues at a faster rate. The SNS inhibits digestion, but it speeds up intestinal motility. That's the speed at which things flow through your intestines, if you know what I mean. And your HPA axis is involved with hormone production, particularly of cortisol, the stress hormone, and adrenaline, the fight or flight hormone. The effects of these hormones stop insulin production. So stress makes you insulin resistant by reducing the insulin sensitivity in your muscles. It also inhibits growth of developing bodies, so like growth of children. Or wound repair, so growth of new tissues. Here are some data that bear that out. This study was conducted at the University of Michigan among undergraduate student test subjects. Researchers made a small standard size incision, usually on the back of the hand of the student, And then the student reported every day so that the researchers could measure how fast the wound was healing. And these wounds were made at two different periods. One during spring break, which was considered a low stress time for the students. And again during final exam week, which is considered a high stress time for the students. And what you can see on the height of the bars in the graph is that during high stress, it took more days for the incision site to heal. This is taken as evidence that the psychological stress of exams slowed wound repair in these students. Here is another example of stress delaying wound healing. This particular research study was done among older adults who were married couples, and one spouse suffered chronic illness. So the other spouse was considered a caregiver trying to care for their ill spouse at home. So these caregivers were presumed to be under a lot of stress, and they were matched by the researchers to a control group who was matched on age, sex, and other underlying factors that influence a person's health. And what we see on the graph is that the caregivers who were under stress took longer to repair the wounds. They took longer to heal than the age, sex, and health matched controls. So the height of the bars here represent the percent of subjects in that group with a fully healed wound. And so we see a higher percent of control subjects with a fully healed wound earlier in the study period. And we're talking about 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 weeks of the study period. This is another well-studied phenomenon, the effect of stress on pregnancy outcome. And in this study, these were women who recognized that they had become pregnant, and they followed them through to see if the pregnancy ended successfully or if sadly the woman experienced a spontaneous miscarriage. And what the graph shows is that more cortisol, and remember I called cortisol the stress hormone, it's produced by the adrenal glands under conditions of stress. More cortisol means more stress, and it led to a higher chance of an unsuccessful pregnancy, aka a spontaneous miscarriage. We also know from additional lines of research that stress during pregnancy may impact the developing baby's physiology long term. We know this from a set of primate studies and increasingly from human subjects research as well. For example, we know that pregnant female macaques, here's a macaque shown in the picture, it's a type of monkey, exposed to loud random noises throughout pregnancy, like gave birth to offspring that were lighter at birth and later displayed impaired neuromotor development, attention deficits, impaired cognitive function, and displayed a higher frequency of abnormal coping behaviors and impaired social behaviors. Now, these loud random noises do not pose any physical threat to the pregnant monkey, but it is certainly psychologically disturbing. So these are examples of how psychological distress can impact a pregnant woman's physiology and impact the physiology of her developing fetus. These same results have been found in human studies where maternal stress happens just in the environment. Nobody's going up behind pregnant ladies, and so it's studied differently, and complex statistical methods are used to assess just the lifestyle of the woman and how much stress she happens to be under. So it's considered a natural experiment just due to variation in women's lives that they're living. But maternal stress in humans studied in this way that is different from the primate studies. It is correlated with infants that similarly have reduced weight at birth and that display developmental delays, attention deficits later in life, hyper anxiety, that means more anxious than average, and impaired social behaviors. So these human studies match the results of the primate studies. Here is another example of stress affecting physiology. In this example, we are witnessing how childhood psychological distress can inhibit growth. This data comes from German orphanages where childhood growth was tracked and in which the orphanages were given standard rations of food and standard medical care for the kids. So the situations at different orphanages were considered rather controlled. And what we see here are 3 lines represented kids at just 2 different orphanages. And the orphanages differ in the temperament of the ladies running them. So when kids who were now grown up were interviewed by the researchers, they reported that the Fräulein Grün, who was at Orphanage A for the first 25 weeks of this look-back period, she was considered a really warm, loving character. The orphans, now grown up, remembered her fondly. They said she read storybooks to them. She would play her guitar and sing to the children. And that contrasts the mean Fräulein Schwartz, who resided over kids in the other orphanage. And what we see during the first 25 weeks of the study is that Fräulein Schwartz's 2 groups of kids, represented by lines B and C here, gained less weight than Fräulein Grün's group of kids, represented by line A. The difference between lines B and C are that the C group was remembered as being part of Fräulein Schwartz's favorites. So she was generally considered cold and mean, but she played favorites, and the C group, as a result of being in her favor, seemed to have gained a little more weight than her unfavored kids in the B group. Now, something interesting happened at about week 25. The Fräuleins were reassigned to each other's orphanages. So what we see in the blue bracket here, notice how the line becomes more steep, meaning kids were gaining more weight in less amount of time. That happened when Fräulein Grün came in to the orphanage where the kids had perhaps been maltreated by Fräulein Schwartz. So once they got a kind, loving caretaker, their growth caught up. This is considered evidence that childhood psychological treatment affects the growth of kids. Additional research demonstrates that stress also predicts cardiometabolic illness long term. Psychosocial stress is associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, atherosclerosis, and reduced insulin sensitivity. And this is true of childhood stress and adult risk of these things. So there are decadal effects. And it's important to protect children from psychosocial stress. If you didn't know that already, please know that there are really, this is a really well documented phenomenon, and if you're interested in this topic, you could research it more for your final presentation. Here is another example of stress impacting health. The Whitehall studies are a famous set of stress studies that reviewed the stress of adults who had served as civil servants working for the British government. And these civil servants could be classified into a hierarchy based on the types of work that they performed. So in the US, the equivalent would be different GS levels within the federal government. The highest rank, called administrators, reported feeling more daily control over their job tasks. And down the ranks, towards the lowest rank, which the researchers called office support staff, these workers reported feeling bossed around all day, which doesn't feel any good. So that's considered psychologically stressful in the workplace. What the graph shows is that with decreasing rank in this British hierarchy of civil servants, there was an increasing risk of dying from chronic heart disease. And this is true whether the researchers statistically controlled just for age, and that's what the light gray bars show, or if they controlled for age as well as additional health risk factors like whether or not the person was a smoker. But what you see on the graph is a clear stepwise increase in risk with decreasing rank. These now famous studies are considered a classic example of how psychosocial stress in the workplace negatively impacts health. The Whitehall studies revealed that the daily stress of the work environment can impact risk of chronic disease over the long term. Additional stressors have also been linked to long-term risk of cardiometabolic diseases like heart disease, atherosclerosis, and type 2 diabetes. And these include living in poverty, lack of social support or feelings of social isolation, job stress, like we talked about, lack of agency. Now, agency refers to feeling like you're in control of your destiny. So when you don't feel in control of your life, that is considered psychologically stressful. A stressful home situation, childhood residence in a low-income neighborhood, even if when you grew up you lived someplace better, and accumulation of SLEs. SLE stands for stressful life event. So this would be like the death of a loved one, or divorce of your parent when one of your caretakers moves out of the house, or experiencing racism, or acts of violence, or crime, abuse, neglect. Any one stressful life event is known to cause alterations in physiology, but when they accumulate and you experience multiple stressful life events in rapid succession, that is known to have an even greater disturbance on physiology, and it ramps up very quickly a person's risk of experiencing chronic cardiometabolic diseases later in life. While much of the research I have shared with you so far, like the Whitehall studies, demonstrate the negative impacts of chronic stress on health many years later, stress is also known to pose an immediate threat to health. As evidence of this, please take a look at this graph, which shows the stock market crash of 2009 and the simultaneous spike in heart attacks that happened at the same moment. Now I've given you enough examples of how stress has been linked to negative health outcomes. The conclusion is that we know stress causes physical damage to the body. We also know that different types of stress, both physical stress and psychological stress, cause the same damage. And you'll remember that I called this the generalized stress response. For example, racist tweets damage the body as if they were acts of physical violence. Now, importantly, I am not equating racist tweets and physical violence, but I am saying that they both damage the body. So here is some food for thought. And I certainly don't have the answer to this, but I think it's important to think about it together as a society. Secondhand smoking causes cancer, so smoking was banned in public places. Following that logic, Should ism and ist rhetoric be similarly censored in the interest of public health? What do you think? So that was a bit of a downer lecture, and I wanted to close with some research-proven ways to curb the negative impacts of stress. So these are all positive things that you can do for your health. Hang out with animals! Owning a pet has been shown to lower risk of cardiovascular disease and have a number of positive impacts on health. Prayer and meditation have been shown to improve health. What you're seeing at the bottom here on this graph is the outcome for patients who had already had a heart attack or stroke, and they were discharged with instructions to either attend health education or attend health education and participate in transcendental meditation. And what this data show is that the group who meditated in addition to the health education had significantly lower risk of suffering an additional heart attack in the 5-year follow-up of this study. Exercise has many known benefits in terms of stress reduction on your health. And if you would like to learn more details about how exercise influences your physical body, including its benefits on brain physiology, I can personally recommend this book called Spark. It would be a fascinating topic for a final presentation if you're into that. Nature! Spending time outdoors, away from the things of man, is now known to have many positive impacts on our physiology. It slows heart rate and combats many of the known negative impacts of stress. And that's the end of the lecture. So please take a moment to revisit your former responses to these questions and see if you learned anything new today. Can you name some more non-biological factors that influence health? Do you now know more about how people's social circumstances impact our well-being? How psychological distress can affect the physical body, and some healthy ways to manage stress. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.